Good morning, students. In the last class, we have completed the lesson The Dear Departed Part 2, and I think you have remembered the story. And what is the story about? Yes, when Abel Merriweather entered their room, he is surprised to see his daughter and son in law, Mrs. and Mr. Jordan. The two sisters and their husbands couldn't believe their eyes. Abel came forward to shake hand with his son in law, Mr. Ben Jordan. Ben retreat with Mrs. Jordan to a safe distance. Mrs. Slater went to her father to check whether he is solid or not. Mr. Abel reveals that he is well enough but has a bit of a headache. Then Abel asked for his new slippers. When he observed Henry wearing his slippers, Mrs. Slater snatched them from Henry and gave to them Abel. He put them on and sits in an armchair. Abel asked them why they all were in mourning. Mrs. Jordan made up some story to pacify him. She tells that Ben's brother had died. Abel tells them to sit down and have a cup of tea. He suggests that they should be jolly. Then he notices his bureau there in that room. At the same time, he hears a clock striking 6. He looked at the clock and questioned them why it is there. He grumbles and scolds for her deceitful acts. Mrs. Jordan blames her sister of robbing their father's things. The two sisters start quarreling. Abel understood his daughter's dishonesty and comes to know the reality. Abel doesn't want to stay with his daughters anymore. He addresses his daughters directly and declares that he is going to change his will, leaving all his property to whoever he is living with when he dies. Mrs. Slater and Mrs. Jordan started to fight with each other to keep their father in their care. Both sisters tried to convince him to make him live with them, but he refuses to stay with them. Then he makes an announcement which shocks everyone. He announces that he has got to do three things the next morning. He has got to go to lawyer and change his will, and he has got to change go to the insurance company to pay the premium, and then he has got to go to St. Philip's Church to get married. Everyone is shocked. He revealed that he has at last found someone who is happy to keep him. When he left the room, he invited them all to his marriage with Mrs. John Shorrocks, who keeps the Ringo bells. He thanks Mrs. Slater for bringing the bureau downstairs, as it will be easier for him to carry it across to the Ringo bells. This is the story which we have completed in the last class, and I think you have understood the story. Now we will move to glossary. Here I have given glossary 1 and 2. Glossary 1 belongs to the lesson The Dear Departed Part 1, and the glossary 2 belongs to The Dear Departed Part 2. We will see glossary 1 first. DA, do you, means used in awkward situations. Precocious means intelligent, gifted, or talented. Bureau, a writing desk with drawers. Drive a hard bargain. Work hard to negotiate agreements in one's own favor. Daft, stupid, or silly. Pinch, steal. Mantelpiece, a shelf projecting from the wall over the fireplace. Usher, lead or show the way or welcome. complacent, self satisfied, unconcerned, chirpily, cheerfully, and actively, snug, warm, and comfortable, overdue, not paid by the expected time, swindling, cheating somebody for property or money, transfixed, became motionless in fear, chuckling, laughing quietly out of mild amusement or satisfaction, clad, wearing a particular type of clothing, malicious, harmful, and glossary 2, gingerly, in a careful, wake poke, in a careful way, gingerly, in a careful way, poke, push, what the devil, old fashioned way of showing annoyance or displeasure. This phrase is always used in questions. Tomfoolery, foolish or silly behavior. What the dicks, old fashioned and informal, used in questions instead of devil to show that you are annoyed or surprised. Indicative whisper, talking about someone in a harsh, hasty manner. Double faced, hypocritical, deceitful, dishonest. Thumping, hitting hard. Will, legal document that says what is to happen to somebody's property of after his or her death. Fancy, want or feel like. Consternation, a worried, sad feeling. Ringo Bells, the name of a restaurant. Handier, easier. These are the meanings, and I want you to write both glossary 1 and 2 neatly in your notebooks. And we'll be moving to the comprehension part. Here, Roman number 2, arrange the following sentences in sequence so that a continuous narrative of the story of the dear departed could be made. So, here they have given some sentences which are jumbled. So, they are asking us to arrange those sentences to form a meaningful story of the dear departed. So, I have already done it for you. So I want you to write them neatly in your notes, and also if it is possible you can number number them in your textbook. Okay, so see, first what they have given, we will see that one day Mrs. Slater felt that Abel Merriweather had died. Suddenly, Victoria came into the room telling that grandfather was moving. The Slaters and the Jordans wanted to ascertain if Abel Merriweather had paid his insurance premium. Abel Merriweather found fault with the two daughters and wanted to change his will. Before the arrival of the Jordans, the Slater had pinched Abel's bureau and clock. Victoria was sent to Abel Merriweather's room to bring the key bunch of the bureau. Abel Merriweather informed that he was going to marry Mrs. John Shorrocks. The Slater sent a telegram to the Jordans about the death of Abel Merriweather. So these are not in an order, isn't it? So they are asking us to arrange them in an order. So I have already done it for you. You observe them and you write it neatly in your notes. One day Mrs. Slater felt that Abel Merriweather had died. And the second is, the Slaters sent a telegram to the Jordans about the death of Abel Merriweather. Third is, Before the arrival of the Jordans, the Slaters had pinched Abel's bureau and clock. And the fourth is the Slaters and the Jordans wanted to ascertain if Abel Merriweather had paid his insurance premium. And the fifth is Victoria was sent to Abel Merriweather's room to bring the key bunch of the bureau. Sixth is suddenly Victoria came into the room telling that grandfather was moving. Seventh is Abel Merriweather found fault with the two daughters and wanted to change his will. And the eighth is Abel Merriweather informed that he was going to marry Mrs. John Shorrocks. So this is the order arranged in a correct way to give the meaning, means to give the story of that dear departed, isn't it? So if you see here the jumbled sentences, you can number them also. See the first one. One day Mrs. Slater felt that Abel Merriweather had died. So if you arrange also, first one is one only and the second one will be sixth. After arranging, the place of the second sentence will be sixth. And the third is fourth, and the fourth is seventh, and the fifth is third, sixth is fifth, seventh is eighth, and eighth is two. So you try to number them or you can write them in a order in your notebook. Okay, see here. Here is a list of traits of a personality. Tick the traits that describe Mrs. Slater's character. So here they are asking you to tick the traits of the tick the traits which describe Mrs. Slater's character. So I have done it for you already. So you can underline or you can tick the word which describes the character of Mrs. Slater. Okay. First one, A, greedy. Greedy describes the character, isn't it? Because Mrs. Slater steals her father's bureau and clock before the arrival of her sister Mrs. Jordan and asks her husband to wear her father's new slippers. So she is greedy, isn't it? So A is greedy. It describes the character of Slater. So underline greedy. Overpowering. It also describes the character of Mrs. Slater. So underline overpowering. Why? Mrs. Slater orders her daughter Victoria to close the door if her aunt Elizabeth and her uncle Ben come. So B, overpowering also explains the character of Mrs. Slater. And C, honest. She is not honest. So you can leave that or you can mark wrong over there. D, sensitive. Sensitive, she is not sensitive, isn't it? So leave that. And E, dominating. She is dominating, isn't it? So the dominating also represents the character of Mrs. Slater. So underline dominating. Why? Because Mrs. Slater dominates her husband to do whatever she orders, isn't it? So underline dominating. And F, blunt. Is she blunt? Yes, you underline blunt because Mrs. Slater asked her daughter to change her dress before her aunt Elizabeth and her husband and her uncle Ben come. So she is blunt. It represents the character of Mrs. Slater. So you have to underline blunt. And eighth, straight talking. Is she straight talking? Yes. So you have to underline that word also, because when Victoria says that her grandpa didn't go to pay his premium, Mrs. Slater snubs her, saying he went out. So you have to underline straight talking because it represents her character. And whereas humble, it doesn't represent her character, isn't it? Because she is not humble. And impolite, she is impolite, isn't it? So you underline impolite, because Mrs. Slater asked her husband Henry, why shouldn't we bring that bureau down here now? We can do it before they come. When Henry says, I wouldn't care to, then Mrs. Slater says to him, don't look so dafty, why not? So she is impolite. So the Slater's character means impolite represents the character of Mrs. Slater. So you underline impolite. Next is insensitive. So she is insensitive, isn't it? So you underline insensitive, because when Victoria says to Mrs. Slater, that's grandpa's clock, she replies, be quiet, it's ours now. When Mrs. Jordan says to her father, I will tell you what's been going on in this house. Nothing short of robbery, she says. Be quiet, Elizabeth. So she is insensitive. Means the word insensitive represent means explains the character of Mrs. Slater, isn't it? So you underline insensitive. Then I think you have understood till here, and if you have any doubts you can ask me. And your today's homework for you is write glossary 1 and 2 in your notebooks neatly without any spelling mistakes, and learn the spellings of those words. And we'll be completing the remaining part of the lesson in the next session. Thank you. Have a good day.